August 15, 1945. 3 months after Victory in Europe Day, a transport truck rumbled through the dusty roads of rural Texas, carrying cargo unlike any the Lone Star State had seen before. Inside sat 43 German women, members of the Wehrmacht's Women's Auxiliary Corps, captured during the final collapse of the Third Reich. They were headed to a makeshift prisoner of war camp outside the small town of Fredericksburg, a place that would challenge everything they believed about their enemies and themselves. The women sat in silence, their gray auxiliary uniforms stained and worn from weeks of transit. Some stared blankly at the truck's canvas walls, while others clutched small personal items, photographs of families they might never see again, letters that could no longer reach their destinations. Among them sat 24-year-old Brunhilde Hartmann, though everyone called her Bruna. She had served as a communications officer in France, believing until the very end that she was defending her homeland from barbarians. Now those same barbarians held her fate in their hands. The truck lurched to a stop outside a compound of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire fencing. The August heat was oppressive, nothing like the cool German summers Bruna remembered. As the tailgate dropped, harsh Texas sunlight flooded the dim interior, and the women squinted against the brightness. American soldiers stood waiting, their rifles held loosely, almost casually. Bruna had expected hatred in their eyes, perhaps cruelty. Instead, she saw mostly curiosity and what might have been discomfort. Captain James Morrison, a rancher's son from West Texas who had been called up for the war's final year, surveyed the arriving prisoners with an expression that mixed duty with uncertainty. He had volunteered to oversee this unusual facility because someone had to do it, but he had never imagined guarding women who looked so young, so exhausted, so utterly defeated. His wife Sarah had asked him just that morning how he felt about it. He still did not have an answer. The women climbed down from the truck with as much dignity as they could muster. 21-year-old Elfriede Schneider, called Frida by her friends, stumbled slightly on the step, her legs cramped from the long journey. An American private instinctively reached out to steady her, then pulled back as if uncertain whether touching an enemy prisoner was allowed. Frida righted herself without his help, her jaw set in determination not to show weakness before these Americans. Captain Morrison stepped forward and spoke in clear, slow English. A young corporal stood beside him, ready to translate into halting German. "Welcome to Camp Fredericksburg. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will be provided quarters, food, and medical care. In return, we expect your cooperation and respect for camp regulations." The translator struggled with several words, but the message was clear enough. The women stood in formation, years of military discipline, keeping their backs straight despite their exhaustion, and wondered what kind of captivity awaited them in this strange, hot land so far from home. The barracks assigned to the German women were simple wooden structures, but they were clean and surprisingly spacious. Each woman received a narrow cot with actual mattresses, thin but present, along with 2 blankets and a pillow. Bruna ran her hand over the rough fabric, remembering the last weeks in Germany where they had slept on bare floors in bombed-out buildings, sometimes without any cover at all. She said nothing, but her eyes betrayed her confusion at this unexpected consideration. The camp itself occupied former ranch land, and the smell of cattle and hay still lingered in the air. Mesquite trees dotted the landscape beyond the fencing, and the horizon stretched endlessly in all directions. For women who had grown up among the forests and villages of Germany, this vast openness felt alien and disorienting. Everything here seemed too big, too bright, too strange. That first evening, the women were called to the mess hall for their initial meal in captivity. They filed in silently, maintaining formation, even though no one had ordered them to do so. The dining area was nothing fancy, just long wooden tables and benches, but it was swept clean and the windows let in the golden light of the setting sun. American guards stood along the walls, watching but not threatening. What appeared on their plates shocked them into complete stillness. Beans, cornbread, and actual meat, not the thin soup or moldy bread they had subsisted on during the final months of the war, but real food in quantities they had not seen in years. Bruna stared at her plate as if it might be some kind of trick. Around her, the other women exchanged glances of disbelief and suspicion. Frida leaned close to Bruna and whispered in German, "Why would they feed us like this? What do they want from us?" Bruna had no answer. Every piece of propaganda they had been taught insisted that Americans were cruel, that prisoners could expect starvation and brutality. Yet here was evidence contradicting everything they believed. The women ate mechanically that first night, their bodies desperate for sustenance, even as their minds struggled to process this contradiction. 27-year-old Anneliese Vogel, called Lisa, had served as a nurse and understood malnutrition better than most. She could see her fellow prisoners were dangerously thin, their bodies showing signs of prolonged deprivation. This food was not luxury. It was basic necessity, offered without ceremony or expectation of gratitude. After the meal, the women were escorted back to their barracks. As they walked through the warm Texas evening, 19-year-old Gertrude Lehmann, the youngest among them and known as Trudy, began to cry softly. She tried to hide it, but her shoulders shook with the effort of containing emotions she could not name. Fear, relief, confusion, and grief mixed together in ways that made no sense. The others pretended not to notice, each woman locked in her own struggle to understand what kind of captivity this would be. The first week passed in a haze of uncertainty and cautious routine. The women woke at dawn, attended roll call, performed assigned light duties like laundry and cleaning, and spent the rest of their time in watchful silence. They spoke only to each other and only in German, maintaining a barrier of language and culture between themselves and their captors. The American guards respected this distance, going about their duties with professional detachment. Captain Morrison watched this carefully maintained separation with growing concern. He had fought in Europe during the war's final months and had seen enough death and destruction to last a lifetime. He did not hate these women, but he also did not know how to reach them. They moved through the camp like ghosts, present but not really there, following orders but offering nothing beyond minimal compliance. Everything changed on the 8th day when the camp received a delivery that would alter the course of 43 lives. A local rancher named Bob Jenkins, who supplied beef to the military facility, arrived with his usual shipment. But this time he brought something extra. His ranch hands had spent the previous day smoking beef in the traditional Texas style, and he had brought several pounds of pulled pork as a gesture of goodwill. When Captain Morrison saw it, he made a decision that protocol did not require but instinct suggested. He ordered the kitchen staff to prepare a proper Texas barbecue for everyone at the camp, guards and prisoners alike. The preparations began in the early afternoon. Mesquite wood was brought in to feed the outdoor cooking pits. The meat was seasoned with a dry rub of spices, then slow cooked until it fell apart at the touch. Beans, simmered in cast-iron pots with molasses and bacon, cornbread, baked in Dutch ovens, buried in coals. The smell that began to drift across the compound was unlike anything the German women had ever experienced. It was rich and smoky, sweet and savory, carrying on the hot wind until it seemed to fill every corner of the camp. Inside their barracks, the women smelled it and felt their stomachs clench with involuntary hunger. 23-year-old Hannelore Muller, called Laura, stood at the window watching smoke rise from the cooking pits. She had been a baker's daughter in Hamburg before the war, and she understood food in ways the others did not. Whatever the Americans were preparing was not ordinary rations. It was something special, something meant to be shared and celebrated. The question was why. When the call came for the evening meal, the German women filed toward the mess hall with their usual disciplined formation. But something was different this time. The smell of smoking meat had been building for hours, growing stronger and more intoxicating with each passing minute. Despite their determination to maintain emotional distance from their captors, biology was undermining their resolve. Several women's stomachs growled audibly. They had not been starved at the camp, but they had been hungry for so long before their capture that their bodies remained in a constant state of craving. The mess hall had been transformed. Long tables were covered with checkered cloths, and platters of food were being carried out by American soldiers who seemed almost cheerful about the task. At the center of everything sat massive trays of pulled pork, the meat glistening and tender, piled high in quantities that seemed impossible. Alongside it were bowls of beans, stacks of cornbread, coleslaw made with fresh cabbage, and even pickles. For men who had grown up on Texas ranches, this was ordinary celebration food. For women who had spent years in wartime Germany, it looked like a feast from a fairy tale. Captain Morrison stood at the front of the hall and spoke in his slow, clear English while the translator relayed his words. "Tonight we share a Texas tradition with you. This is barbecue, the way we cook in this part of America. You are welcome to eat as much as you like. There is plenty for everyone." He gestured to the tables invitingly, then stepped back to let the women approach. But they did not move. Bruna stood at the front of the formation, her face carefully composed, and the other women took their cue from her. This abundance felt like a trap or perhaps a mockery. How could their enemies offer such generosity when Germany lay in ruins? What would be expected in return? The propaganda they had been taught whispered warnings in their minds. Americans wanted to corrupt them, to make them forget their loyalty, to break their spirit with false kindness. One by one, the women shook their heads. Bruna spoke quietly in German to her companions. "We cannot accept this. It is not right. We are prisoners, not guests." The other women murmured agreement, though their eyes kept drifting to the food despite their words. They turned as a group and began to file back toward the barracks, maintaining their dignity even as their stomachs protested the decision. The American soldiers watched in confused silence, unable to understand why anyone would refuse such a meal. Captain Morrison stood holding a serving spoon, his expression reflecting genuine bewilderment at this unexpected rejection. Private Jake Martinez had grown up on a ranch 50 miles south of the camp, the son of Mexican immigrants who had built a life through hard work and determination. At 26 years old, he had seen enough of the world during his military service to understand that pride and hunger often went to war inside a person's heart. As he watched the German women walk away from the feast, he recognized something in their rigid backs and lifted chins that reminded him of his own grandmother, who had once refused charity from neighbors even when the family had nothing to eat. He found Captain Morrison standing in the mess hall, staring at the untouched food with an expression of frustrated confusion. The captain was a good man, but had spent his life in relative comfort, never knowing what it meant to be so desperate that accepting help felt like surrender. Jake approached carefully, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. "Sir, if I may say something?" Morrison nodded, grateful for any insight into what had just happened. "They think it is a test," Jake said quietly. "Or maybe they think we are mocking them. Where I come from, when you have been hungry long enough, food from someone else's hand feels like losing something important, like admitting you cannot take care of yourself." Morrison considered this, then looked at the mountains of food that would go to waste if something did not change. "What would you suggest, Private?" Jake thought for a key moment, then smiled slightly. "Let me try something, sir. Give me permission to take some of this food to them, but let me do it my way." An hour later, Jake walked across the compound carrying a single plate covered with a cloth napkin. He had changed out of his uniform into civilian clothes, jeans, and a work shirt that made him look less like a soldier and more like the ranch hand he had been before the war. He approached the women's barracks and knocked gently on the door frame. When Bruna appeared, suspicious and defensive, he held up the plate but did not try to hand it to her. He spoke in English, knowing she would not understand all the words, but hoping his tone would convey his meaning. "Ma'am, I am not here as a guard. I am here as someone whose grandmother taught him that food is not about power, it is about sharing what you have." He set the plate down on the wooden step, then stepped back several paces. "This is not charity, and it is not a trick. It is just food, good food, and there is plenty more where it came from. You do not have to accept it, but if you do, nobody will think less of you for being hungry." Bruna stared at him, trying to understand not just his words, but his intent. Behind her, the other women had gathered, drawn by curiosity and by the smell of the food that drifted from beneath the cloth. Jake met her eyes with an expression of patient kindness, then touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect and walked away, leaving the plate where he had set it down. The plate sat untouched on the barrack step for nearly 20 minutes. Inside, the women tried to ignore it, but the smell seemed to grow stronger rather than fade. Bruna sat on her cot, staring at the wall, while the others pretended to occupy themselves with small tasks, folding already folded clothes, writing letters that could not be sent, reading books in the fading evening light. But their attention kept returning to that covered plate just beyond the door. Frida finally broke the silence. "He left it there. He did not wait for thanks or try to watch us. He just left it." Her voice carried a note of confusion that matched what they all felt. This simple gesture contradicted everything they had been taught about American soldiers. There was no coercion, no expectation, no audience to witness their humiliation if they accepted. Just food offered and left behind. Lisa, the former nurse, understood the physical toll their refusal was taking. She could see it in the way Trudy's hands trembled slightly, in the hollow look behind Laura's eyes, in the way several women touched their stomachs unconsciously. They had been getting adequate rations at the camp, but adequate was not the same as satisfied. Their bodies still carried the memory of prolonged starvation, and that smell of smoked meat was triggering responses beyond their control. The evening air carried more than just the scent of that single plate. Across the compound, the Americans were eating their barbecue, and the wind brought waves of that rich, complex aroma. It was torture of the most unexpected kind, not deliberate cruelty, but the simple presence of abundance they had denied themselves. Laura stood at the window, watching smoke still rising from the outdoor pits, and felt tears prick her eyes. She tried to remember the last time she had seen this much food in one place. Before the war, perhaps, when her father's bakery had been full and prosperous, and the future had seemed secure. Trudy, the youngest, was the first to admit the truth they all felt. "I am so hungry." Her voice was small, almost ashamed. "I know we cannot accept it. I know we should not, but I am so hungry, and it smells like something wonderful, and I do not understand why that is wrong." She looked around at the other women, her 19-year-old face showing the vulnerability that the others tried to hide behind military discipline and adult reserve. Bruna stood and walked to the door. She looked down at the covered plate, then out across the compound where she could see American soldiers sitting at outdoor tables, eating and talking in the relaxed way of men sharing a meal. There was no celebration of victory over defeated enemies, no mockery of their refusal. Just people eating good food on a warm evening. She bent down slowly and picked up the plate, her hands steady despite the emotions churning inside her. Bruna carried the plate inside and set it on the small table in the center of the barracks. The women gathered around it like pilgrims, approaching something sacred, or perhaps forbidden. The cloth napkin covered whatever lay beneath, and for a long moment, nobody moved to lift it. They all understood that this was a threshold. Once crossed, something fundamental would change in their relationship to this place and these people who held them captive. It was Laura who finally reached out and pulled back the cloth. What lay beneath stopped their breath. A generous portion of pulled pork, still warm, the meat so tender it seemed to shimmer in the lamplight. Alongside it, cornbread with butter melting into its golden surface, beans rich with molasses, and a small container of sauce that gleamed dark red. The plate had been arranged with care, not just dumped together, but presented as if they were guests rather than prisoners. Nobody spoke. The smell rising from the plate was overwhelming now, without the barrier of cloth to mute it. Sweet and smoky, rich with spices they could not name, carrying hints of wood smoke and slow cooking and care. It smelled like abundance, like generosity, like everything they had been denied for so long. Frida felt her eyes filling with tears and did not fully understand why. It was just food, just meat and bread and beans, but somehow it represented something larger that she could not put into words. Bruna picked up the single fork that had been provided. Her hand shook slightly as she speared a small piece of the pork and lifted it to her mouth. The moment the meat touched her tongue, her carefully maintained composure cracked. The flavor was unlike anything she remembered, rich and complex, tender beyond belief, seasoned with a perfection that spoke of tradition and skill and abundance. She chewed slowly, and a single tear rolled down her cheek despite her best effort to contain it. The other women watched her face and saw their own hunger reflected there. One by one, they reached toward the plate, using their fingers when the single fork was not enough, sharing this small portion among 43 souls. Each woman took only a tiny amount, trying to make it last, trying to make it fair. But that single taste was enough to break something inside them. The wall they had built between themselves and their captors, the determination to remain apart and untouched by American influence, crumbled before the simple reality of good food freely given. Trudy was the first to cry openly, her shoulders shaking with sobs. She could no longer control. Then Frida joined her, and then Lore, and soon nearly every woman in the barracks was weeping, not just from hunger satisfied, but from the sudden recognition of how long they had been denying themselves comfort, how much they had lost, and how unexpected it was to find kindness in this place they had been taught to fear. The weeping continued long after the small portion of food had been consumed. The women sat on their cots or stood by the windows crying in ways they had not allowed themselves since their capture. Some wept silently with tears streaming down their faces. Others sobbed openly, their bodies shaking with the release of emotions held too tightly for too long. It was not just about the food, though the food had been the catalyst. It was about everything the food represented. Bruna sat with her face in her hands, feeling the weight of responsibility she had carried pressing down on her shoulders. She had led these women in their refusal, convinced it was the right choice, the dignified choice. But dignity purchased at the cost of needless suffering was not strength. It was foolish pride. The Americans had offered them something simple and good, and she had nearly denied her companions even that small comfort because she could not let go of beliefs that no longer served any purpose. Lisa moved among the women with her nurse's instinct for comfort, touching shoulders, offering quiet words. But she was crying too, her professional composure dissolved by the unexpected generosity they had experienced. She had treated wounded soldiers in field hospitals, had seen the worst that war could do to human bodies. She thought she had become hardened to suffering. But this simple act of kindness had reached past all her defenses to touch something she thought she had lost. Outside, Private Martinez stood in the shadows near the barracks, listening to the sounds of weeping that carried through the wooden walls. He had expected many possible reactions to his gesture, but this profound outpouring of emotion surprised even him. Captain Morrison joined him, drawn by the sounds of distress. "Should we check on them?" he asked with concern in his voice. Jake shook his head slowly. "No, sir. Let them cry. Sometimes tears are the only way to wash away what words cannot reach." The crying gradually subsided as full darkness fell over the camp. Women began to compose themselves, wiping their eyes and taking shaky breaths. Frida stood and walked to the door, looking out toward the mess hall, where lights still burned. She could see American soldiers moving about, cleaning up from the evening meal. Normal men doing normal tasks, not monsters from propaganda posters, not cruel captors waiting to exploit their prisoners' weakness, just men who had offered food and expected nothing in return. She turned back to face her companions and spoke quietly in German. "We should go. There is more food, and they invited us. We refused because we were afraid. But I think we were wrong to be afraid." Hannelore nodded in agreement. "My father always said that you can know a person's heart by how they treat those who cannot repay them. These Americans owe us nothing. We are their enemies, yet they offer us their best food as if we are worth something." The women looked to Bruna for direction, old habits of military hierarchy still strong among them. She stood slowly, straightened her worn uniform, and wiped the last traces of tears from her face. "Then, let us go and accept what has been offered. Let us stop being prisoners who refuse everything and start being human beings who can recognize kindness when it appears." The 43 women walked across the compound in the darkness, no longer in military formation, but in a loose group that spoke more of uncertainty than discipline. As they approached the mess hall, they could see through the windows that the American soldiers were still there, some eating late portions, others playing cards at the cleared tables. When the door opened and the German women filed inside, conversation stopped and all eyes turned toward them. Captain Morrison stood immediately, his face showing relief and something that might have been respect. He gestured toward the tables where platters of food remained, still warm, still abundant. "Please," he said simply, "there is plenty. Help yourselves." The translator repeated the words in German, though the captain's meaning had been clear enough without translation. This was not about language barriers. It was about something deeper than words could easily convey. The women approached the food slowly, almost reverently. What they saw before them seemed impossible. After years of rationing in Germany, after months of genuine hunger, after weeks of adequate but plain food in captivity, this abundance appeared like something from a dream. Bruna picked up a plate and began to serve herself, her hands still trembling slightly. The other women followed her lead, taking generous portions because that was what had been offered, not the meager scraps they had trained themselves to expect. Jake Martinez watched from his position near the kitchen door, and he noticed something that made him smile, despite the seriousness of the moment. The women were not just eating, they were experiencing. Each bite seemed to register on their faces as revelation. The pulled pork, tender and flavorful beyond their experience. The beans, sweet with molasses and rich with bacon fat. The cornbread, golden and buttery. Even the coleslaw, crisp and tangy, brought visible reactions of surprise and pleasure. Frida sat next to an American corporal who had nervously moved over to make room for her. She took a bite of the pork and closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, tears were streaming down her face once more. The corporal, a young man from Ohio named Robert Chen, looked alarmed. "Are you okay? Is something wrong with the food?" Frida shook her head, unable to explain in English what she was feeling. It was not wrong. It was so right that it hurt. Laura understood what Frida could not articulate. This abundance revealed something they had not been prepared to face. They had been told that America was weak, that Americans were soft and spoiled, that German discipline and sacrifice would overcome American decadence. But this food told a different story. It spoke of a country with resources so vast that even prisoners of war could be fed like honored guests. It demonstrated a casual generosity that came from genuine plenty rather than propaganda promises. The meal continued in relative silence, but it was not the hostile silence of their first days. It was the quieter hush of people focused on something important, something that required their full attention. Around the tables, German women and American soldiers sat together, not yet speaking much, but sharing space and food in a way that began to break down the barriers that war had built between them. The morning after the barbecue brought a shift in the camp's atmosphere that everyone could feel, but nobody quite knew how to name. The German women attended roll call as usual, but their postures had softened slightly. The rigid military bearing that had defined them since their arrival had given way to something more natural, more human. When American guards nodded greetings, several of the women nodded back, instead of staring straight ahead in practiced indifference. Bruna spent that morning in the barracks writing a letter she knew could never be sent. The international mail system was still disrupted, and even if it had been functioning, she had no way of knowing if her family in Hamburg still lived or if their address still existed. But she wrote anyway, pouring onto paper thoughts she needed to express, even if no one would ever read them. "Dear Mama," she began in careful German script, "I am alive and well in a place called Texas. Yesterday I ate the finest meat I have ever tasted, and I cried because it was given to me by enemies who treated me better than friends." Around her, other women were engaged in similar acts of impossible communication. Lise wrote to her younger sister, telling her about the strange hot land they now inhabited and the unexpected kindness they had found there. Trudy wrote to her parents, describing the food in detail because she thought it might make them happy to know she was being fed so well. Hannelore wrote to her late husband, though he had died in the war's final weeks, because writing to him still brought comfort, even though he would never read her words. These letters became a daily ritual. Each morning, the women would gather in the barracks or outside under the shade of the few trees, writing messages to people they might never see again, describing experiences that seemed impossible to explain. How could they make their families understand that their American captors had offered them abundance? That the enemy they had been taught to fear had shown them more consideration than they had received from their own countrymen in the war's desperate final months? Private Chen, who had taken an interest in the women's welfare, noticed this letter-writing ritual and mentioned it to Captain Morrison. The captain made inquiries and discovered that while regular mail service was impossible, the Red Cross was beginning to establish systems for locating displaced persons and facilitating communication. He arranged for the Red Cross representative to visit the camp and meet with the German women, offering them the possibility that their letters might actually reach their destinations. The Red Cross representative, a middle-aged woman named Eleanor Hartley, arrived on a scorching afternoon. She sat with each woman individually, carefully noting names and last known addresses of family members, explaining that the process would be slow and success was not guaranteed. But she offered something more valuable than certainty. She offered hope. For the first time since their capture, the women had a tangible connection to the possibility of finding their loved ones. That evening, the women rewrote their letters with new care, knowing these versions might actually be read by the people they addressed. The tone shifted slightly, less detail about the abundance they had experienced, more emphasis on their safety and well-being. They instinctively understood that describing American generosity might be misunderstood by families struggling in occupied Germany. The third week of their captivity brought unexpected education in the form of newsreels and newspapers. Captain Morrison had decided that keeping the women isolated from information about the war's aftermath served no purpose and might actually hinder their eventual reintegration into society. He arranged for weekly screenings of news footage in the mess hall, giving the women a chance to see what had been happening in Europe since their capture. The first screening was scheduled for a Tuesday evening. The women filed into the darkened mess hall, where a projector had been set up, uncertain what they were about to witness. The footage began with scenes of Allied victory celebrations, crowds filling streets in London and Paris and New York. The women watched these images with mixed emotions, seeing the joy of people celebrating Germany's defeat. It was strange to watch strangers rejoicing over the destruction of everything they had known, but then the footage shifted to something that would change their understanding forever. Images appeared on the screen that seemed too horrific to be real. Skeletal figures in striped uniforms standing behind barbed wire. Piles of emaciated bodies, walking skeletons with hollow eyes staring at cameras. The narrator's voice spoke in English about liberation of concentration camps, about places called Dachau and Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz. Words like systematic extermination and industrial murder echoed in the hall. Bruna felt her stomach turn over. Around her, women gasped and covered their mouths. Frida began to shake her head slowly, as if refusing to accept what her eyes were seeing. "This cannot be real," she whispered in German. "This is propaganda. They are lying to us." But even as she spoke, doubt crept into her voice. The images were too detailed, too numerous, too consistent to be fabricated. And why would the Americans show such horrors to German prisoners unless they were true? The newsreel continued relentlessly. Footage of American soldiers forcing German civilians to tour the camps, to see what had been done in their name, close-ups of Nazi records documenting the systematic murder of millions, interviews with survivors who could barely speak, their faces showing trauma beyond comprehension. When the projector finally clicked off and the lights came up, the 43 women sat in stunned silence. Captain Morrison stood before them, his face grave. "I debated whether to show you this," he said quietly, while the translator repeated his words. "But I believe you deserve to know the truth about what was done in your country's name. You were soldiers serving what you believed was a righteous cause. Now you must decide what to do with this knowledge." Nobody responded. What could they say? The women filed out of the mess hall like people leaving a funeral, their faces reflecting shock and denial, and the beginning of terrible understanding. That night, Bruna sat on her cot with her diary open, but unable to write. Her mind kept returning to those images, trying to reconcile them with everything she had believed about Germany, about duty, about honor. She had served the Reich, thinking she was defending civilization. What if she had actually been serving something monstrous? The days following the newsreel screening were heavy with unspoken grief. The women moved through their routines mechanically, but their faces showed the weight of knowledge they could not unknow. Some refused to believe what they had seen, insisting it was Allied propaganda designed to break their spirit. Others fell into profound depression, unable to reconcile their service to the Reich with the horrors that service had unknowingly supported. The camp felt different, charged with an emotional tension that even the American guards could sense. Jake Martinez noticed that several women had stopped eating properly again, not from pride this time, but from what appeared to be genuine despair. He mentioned this to Captain Morrison, who consulted with the camp's medical officer. The doctor's recommendation was simple but profound. Keep feeding them. Keep treating them well. Let them see through daily actions that humanity can exist even after terrible things have happened. Give them time to process and a safe place to do it. Morrison took the advice to heart and made a decision that would prove transformative. He arranged for the evening meals to become communal events, where guards and prisoners ate together rather than separately. No more barriers between captor and captive, just people sharing food and space. The first such dinner was awkward, with Germans and Americans sitting at the same tables but maintaining careful distance and avoiding conversation. But food has a way of breaking down barriers that words cannot easily cross. Private Chen, sitting across from Lise, noticed she was not eating much and gently pushed a bowl of mashed potatoes toward her with an encouraging smile. She looked up, surprised by the gesture, and took a small serving. At another table, Jake found himself next to Hannelore and used hand gestures to ask if she wanted more bread. She nodded gratefully, and he passed the basket with a warmth that transcended their language barrier. These small interactions multiplied over subsequent meals. Conversations began tentatively, with the few women who spoke some English serving as bridges. Frida discovered that Corporal Chen's parents had immigrated to America seeking a better life, and she found herself asking him questions about what that journey had been like. Her own country had once seemed like the center of the world, but now it lay in ruins while America stood strong and prosperous. What had made the difference? The American soldiers, for their part, were surprised to discover that the German women were not the fanatical Nazis they had been taught to expect. These were ordinary young women who had been caught up in extraordinary evil without fully understanding what they were part of. Many had joined the Auxiliary Corps thinking they were serving in defensive roles, never imagining the scope of atrocities being committed by their government. Their genuine shock at the newsreel footage had been impossible to fake. One evening during the fourth week, something remarkable happened. Laura began to hum a melody while serving herself dinner. It was an old German folk song, something her grandmother had taught her as a child. Without thinking, she began to sing the words quietly. Several other German women joined in, their voices harmonizing naturally. The American soldiers listened, and though they could not understand the words, they recognized the universal language of music and memory and home. August turned to September, and the Texas heat began to ease slightly, though it remained warmer than anything the German women had experienced in their homeland. The camp had settled into routines that felt less like imprisonment and more like an unusual community. The women worked in the kitchen, tended the small garden that had been planted, and helped with laundry and mending. They were kept busy not as punishment, but as a way to maintain purpose and structure in their days. The Red Cross letters began to arrive in mid-September, and each one brought either relief or heartbreak. Frida received word that her mother and younger brother had survived and were living in the British occupation zone, though their home had been destroyed. She wept with joy at knowing they were alive, then wept again when she read her mother's description of the devastation surrounding them. Food was scarce, work was impossible to find, and the future seemed bleak beyond imagination. Bruna's letter brought worse news. Her family's neighborhood in Hamburg had been obliterated by bombing raids. The Red Cross could find no record of her parents or siblings. They were likely dead, though without confirmation she was left in the terrible limbo of not knowing. She read the letter alone in the barracks, then carefully folded it and placed it in her diary. She did not cry. The grief was too large for tears. Trudy received no letter at all. Her family had lived in the Eastern Zone, now controlled by the Soviets, and communication there was even more difficult. She existed in a state of anxious uncertainty, not knowing if her parents lived or died, if her hometown still existed, if she would ever see familiar faces again. The not knowing was its own special torture, worse in some ways than confirmed loss. As more letters arrived, a pattern emerged that none of the women could ignore. Those who received news from Germany heard stories of deprivation, destruction, and despair. Families were scattered or dead. Homes were rubble. Food was desperately scarce. The country they had served no longer existed in any meaningful way. What remained was occupied territory, divided among the Allies, a defeated nation trying to survive day by day with no clear path forward. Meanwhile, their daily reality in the Texas camp offered a stark contrast. They ate well, slept in clean barracks, received medical care when needed, and were treated with basic dignity. The cognitive dissonance became impossible to ignore. Their homeland offered only devastation and uncertainty. Their enemy's land offered safety and plenty. The women began to have conversations late at night, speaking in hushed German about questions that felt dangerous even to voice. Lisa finally articulated what many were thinking. What do we return to? Even if we can find our families, what kind of life awaits us there? We will be women who were captured, who spent months in enemy hands. They will say we were corrupted, that we collaborated, that we are no longer trustworthy. And what will we eat? Where will we live? How will we survive in a country that has nothing left? October brought cooler weather and an announcement that changed everything. Captain Morrison called a general assembly in the mess hall, his face showing the weight of the message he carried. The War Department had finalized repatriation procedures for German prisoners of war. Transport ships were being organized to return POWs to occupied Germany. The women's departure was scheduled for early November, less than a month away. The announcement landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of anxiety through the assembled women. They had known this moment would come eventually, but the concrete timeline made it suddenly, terrifyingly real. In 4 weeks, they would board ships bound for a country that no longer felt like home, to face futures that seemed to offer nothing but hardship and suspicion. That evening, the barracks filled with urgent conversations. Some women spoke of their duty to return and help rebuild Germany, to find whatever remained of their families and make the best of difficult circumstances. Others expressed fears they had been suppressing for weeks. Hannelore spoke of letters from her cousin, describing women being assaulted by occupation forces, of former Wehrmacht personnel being treated with contempt, of the constant hunger that made each day a struggle for survival. Bruna sat quietly listening to the debate swirl around her. She had no family to return to, no home waiting for her arrival. Germany represented only graves and ruins, and the burden of collective guilt for horrors she had not known existed but had unwittingly served. Meanwhile, this strange Texas camp had offered her something she had not expected to find. Not just safety and adequate food, but the possibility of redemption through honest work and relationships built on mutual respect rather than ideological fervor. Private Martinez found her sitting outside the barracks the next morning, watching the sunrise paint the endless Texas sky in shades of pink and gold. He sat down nearby, respecting the space between them, but offering quiet companionship. She spoke in her careful English, which had improved dramatically over the weeks. In Germany, I would be woman who was captured. Here, I am just woman who works hard and tries to be good person. Is strange to think enemy country feels more like home than homeland. Jake nodded slowly. Home is not just where you come from. Sometimes it is where people see you for who you really are, instead of what they expect you to be. His words settled over her like a benediction, giving voice to feelings she had not known how to express. Over the following days, similar conversations happened throughout the camp. American soldiers and German prisoners talking honestly about futures and possibilities and the strange bonds that had formed between them. By the end of the week, Bruna made a decision that felt both terrifying and absolutely right. She requested a meeting with Captain Morrison. When she sat across from him in his office, she spoke words she had never imagined saying. Captain, I wish to request permission to stay in America. I do not want to return to Germany. Captain Morrison stared at Bruna for a long moment, certain he had misunderstood her English. But her face showed complete sincerity, and her eyes held a desperate hope that could not be mistaken. He leaned back in his chair, processing the implications of her unprecedented request. No protocol existed for prisoners of war who refused repatriation. The Geneva Convention provided for the return of POWs to their home countries, not for their immigration to enemy nations. Bruna continued speaking, her words tumbling out in a rush of emotion and careful English. I have no family in Germany. My city is destroyed. Here I have found work, purpose, kindness. I know this is an unusual request, but I am asking anyway. Please let me stay. Morrison felt the weight of her plea and knew this was beyond his authority to grant. But he also recognized the sincerity behind it and felt moved by her courage in asking. Word of Bruna's request spread through the camp like wildfire. That evening, 8 other women approached her, speaking in urgent German about their own desires to remain in America. Frida, despite knowing her mother and brother still lived, feared returning to a devastated country where former Auxiliary Corps members faced suspicion and scorn. Lisa saw no future in nursing amid the chaos of occupied Germany. Hannelore, Trudy, and 5 others expressed similar sentiments. They had found something here that Germany could no longer offer. The next morning, all 9 women stood before Captain Morrison in a formal delegation. Through Bruna, who served as their spokesperson, they made their case. They understood the irregularity of their request. They knew they were asking for something that protocol did not permit. But they were asking anyway, as human beings seeking the possibility of better lives than awaited them in their defeated homeland. They offered to work, to prove their worth, to do whatever was necessary to earn the right to stay. Morrison listened to their plea with growing sympathy, but also mounting concern about the political and bureaucratic nightmare this would create. He promised to forward their request to his superiors and to the War Department, though he warned them not to hope too strongly. The regulations were clear, and exceptions were rarely granted, especially for enemy nationals seeking to remain in the United States. The women accepted his caution, but did not abandon their hope. Over the following days, they threw themselves into their work with renewed intensity, as if demonstrating their value might influence decisions being made in distant offices. They volunteered for extra duties, helped American soldiers with tasks beyond their assignments, and showed through actions rather than words why they deserved consideration. The other German women, those who had decided to return to Germany, watched this development with mixed emotions. Some felt the 9 were being disloyal to their homeland. Others understood the motivation, but lacked the courage to make similar requests. A divide began to form within the group, not hostile but noticeable, between those committed to returning and those desperately hoping to stay. The response from the War Department arrived 2 weeks later, and it was not what anyone expected. The 9 women who had requested to remain would not be granted immediate immigration status, but neither would they be forced onto the repatriation ships. Instead, they would be reclassified as displaced persons and transferred to a facility where their cases could be reviewed individually. It was not approval, but it was not denial either. It was possibility wrapped in bureaucratic uncertainty. The news divided the camp's emotions sharply. The 9 women felt overwhelming relief mixed with anxiety about the unknown process ahead. The 34 who were leaving felt a complex mixture of emotions. Some were relieved to be returning home despite the hardships awaiting them. Others felt a pang of regret that they lacked the courage to request what Bruna and her companions had dared to ask for. The final days before departure were filled with bittersweet farewells. Women who had shared barracks and meals and the transformative experience of this unusual captivity now faced permanent separation. They exchanged addresses, though none could be certain the letters would reach their destinations. They made promises to reconnect someday, knowing that someday might never come. On the morning of departure, the 34 women assembled in their best approximation of proper uniforms. Captain Morrison addressed them with words that acknowledged both the unusual nature of their captivity and his hope for their futures. "You came here as our enemies," he said. "You leave as people we have come to respect. I hope you will carry back to Germany the memory that Americans can show mercy without forgetting justice." The women boarded the transport trucks that would take them to the port. Many were crying, not from fear, but from the emotional weight of leaving a place that had become unexpectedly significant in their lives. As the trucks pulled away, the 9 remaining women stood watching, feeling both guilt at staying and relief at being spared the uncertain future their companions faced. Among those departing was a woman named Erica, who had become close friends with Frida during their months of captivity. Before boarding, she had pressed a letter into Frida's hands. "Read this later," she had said. "And remember that some of us understand why you are staying, even if we cannot do the same." Frida clutched that letter as the trucks disappeared down the dusty road, knowing that this moment marked the end of one chapter and the uncertain beginning of another. The camp felt empty with 34 fewer occupants. The remaining 9 women, along with the American personnel who had grown accustomed to their presence, moved through the day in a subdued mood. That evening, Captain Morrison invited the 9 to his office. He had received further instructions about their transfer to the Displaced Persons Facility, scheduled for the following week. The Displaced Persons Facility outside San Antonio was a temporary city of people caught between worlds. Refugees from across Europe, former POWs, and individuals whose homes no longer existed lived in a state of bureaucratic limbo while their cases were reviewed. The 9 German women arrived expecting another camp, but found instead a different kind of community, united by uncertainty and hope. The processing took months. Each woman underwent interviews, background checks, and evaluations to determine if she could be granted permission to remain in the United States. They needed sponsors, proof of employable skills, and evidence that they posed no security threat. The investigation was thorough and often frustrating, but it was also the gateway to the futures they desperately wanted. Bruna's case moved forward first. Captain Morrison had written a letter of recommendation describing her work ethic, her language skills, and her genuine transformation during captivity. The Henderson family, whom she had never met but who had heard her story from Jake Martinez, offered to sponsor her. They owned a small translation business in Austin and needed someone with German language expertise to help with the increasing volume of documents coming from occupied Germany. By spring of 1946, Bruna received the news that changed her life. Her application for permanent residency had been approved. She could stay in America legally, work freely, and eventually apply for citizenship. When she read the letter, she sat down hard on her bunk and cried tears of relief so profound that her whole body shook. After everything she had lost, after all the uncertainty, she had been given a second chance at life. The other women's cases followed over subsequent months. Frida found sponsorship through a medical program that needed nurses, especially those who spoke German and could help with displaced persons from Europe. Lise was accepted into a teaching program. Hannelore found work with a manufacturing company. One by one, the 9 women received permission to build new lives in America, to become immigrants rather than prisoners, to transform their identities from defeated enemies to contributing members of society. Their transitions were not without challenges. They faced suspicion from some Americans who could not forget they were former enemy nationals. They struggled with language barriers, cultural differences, and the persistent guilt of knowing what their country had done during the war. Some nights, Bruna would wake from nightmares about the newsreel footage, wondering how she could have been so blind to the evil she had unknowingly served. But they also found unexpected acceptance. The Americans they worked with saw them not as symbols of Nazi Germany, but as individual women trying to build honest lives from the wreckage of war. Communities that had initially been skeptical came to appreciate their work ethic, their genuine remorse about their country's actions, and their determination to prove themselves worthy of the second chances they had been given. Years passed, and the 9 women built lives that would have been impossible to imagine during those first days in the Texas camp. 25 years after that August evening, when German women prisoners first refused pulled pork before breaking down and accepting it, Bruna Henderson stood before a university audience in Austin, Texas. She had been invited to speak about reconciliation, immigration, and the unexpected paths that lead people to become who they are. Her gray hair was styled in the American fashion, and she spoke English with only the faintest accent, but she had never forgotten where she came from or how she had arrived at this place. She told them about the barbecue that had changed 43 lives, about the smell of smoking meat that had tortured them with its abundance, about the pride that had nearly cost them a moment of genuine human connection, about the young cowboy who had understood that food given without expectation could crack open hearts that propaganda had tried to seal shut, and about the tears they had shed when they finally allowed themselves to accept kindness from people they had been taught to hate. The students listened in rapt attention as she described how that single meal had begun a process of transformation, how the pulled pork had become a symbol of everything they discovered about America. Not just its material abundance, but its capacity for generosity toward enemies, its willingness to offer second chances, its belief that people could change and grow and become better than their past. Bruna spoke about the other 8 women who had chosen to stay. Frida had become a prominent nurse and eventually a hospital administrator. Lisa had taught German language and literature at a high school, influencing hundreds of students. Hannelore had married an American veteran and raised 3 children who never quite believed their mother's stories about being a prisoner of war. All 9 had built meaningful lives, contributed to their communities, and proved that former enemies could become valued citizens. She also spoke about the 34 who had returned to Germany and how several had written to her over the years, describing their own journeys of rebuilding and reconciliation. They had chosen different paths, but all 43 women had been changed by their months in that Texas camp, by the Americans who had treated them with unexpected dignity, and by the moment when they had to choose between pride and humanity. As Bruna concluded her speech, she held up a faded photograph from 1945 showing German women and American soldiers sitting together at tables laden with food. "That meal taught me that home is not determined by the place you were born," she said. "Home is where people see you as fully human despite every reason they have to see you as enemy. Home is where kindness is offered even when it is not deserved. Home is where you are given the chance to become better than you were." The audience rose in applause, but Bruna's mind was elsewhere. She was remembering the taste of that pulled pork, the shock of unexpected flavor, and the way tears had mixed with food as something broke open inside her chest. One meal had not solved everything, but it had opened a door. And sometimes that is all transformation requires, just a door, and the courage to walk through it.